Welcome to the Miscarriage Hope Desk Podcast, where we help women struggling with recurrent pregnancy loss by sharing stories of hope and interviews with experts in the field of fertility and miscarriage. If you want to download our free lab checklist, go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/labs. Again, you will go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/LABS to download your free checklist. If you want to connect with others going through recurrent miscarriage, please check out our show notes for a link to our Facebook group. Now I'm going to hand it over to your host, Laura Bowder, for today's episode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Miscarriage Hope Desk Podcast. Today, I have Sandra Etherington with us. And Sandra is the mom of a 5- and 7-year-old, and she does a lot of work with families and personalities. So, Sandra, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to be. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Can you share with us a little more about what you do, a little introduction, and why you wanted to share your story with us today?
Yeah, so I work with families and personality type and understanding your personality type, your parenting partner's personality type, your kids' personality types. And, when I saw your podcast and what you do, it really hit home for me because building my family was a really rough go. And I felt really lonely during that whole time. And so, if podcasts weren't big yet, and if I'd had a podcast where I could listen to other people going through the same thing, I think that would have been really healing and really cathartic. So I guess I just wanted to participate in that and share my story and maybe help where I can.
Yeah, and we really appreciate that. And that's exactly why we have the podcast, is because we know how isolating it can feel, and we really do want to share our stories. So why don't we hop right in and have you share a little bit about, like you said, your journey to building your family?
Yeah, so I started trying to become pregnant when I was, I don't know, maybe 28 or so. And I'd been married for, I don't know, maybe a year or two. And I was really excited about it. And we became pregnant pretty quickly, 3 or 4 cycles. And I was one of those people who was like really into trying to get pregnant. Like I was doing all the stuff. I was like charting and whatever.
What does that say about our personality?
Oh, it says a lot. Let me tell you. And so I was already frustrated, and I know a lot of people try for a long time, but already at like cycle 4, I was like, why isn't this happening? And then I did become pregnant, and it was just like, I know not everyone experiences pregnancy the same way, but for me, it was like, as soon as I got that positive test, it was like, everything felt like it changed. And I already felt like a mom. I already felt like a parent. And like, it was almost like that balance of what was important to me had shifted in that moment. And like, at the time I was working on a career change. I was back in school, and it was like, that became so secondary. And so when I miscarried, it was like devastating, because all of a sudden I had to go back to not being pregnant and not having that like new purpose in life. But it wasn't like I was magically able to like rewind and have the career change that I was doing feel as important anymore. Like I just couldn't. And so it was really hard. Like I just felt like I was grieving, and I didn't know that people who lost pregnancies had to grieve. In fact, I had a pretty easy life and had never really had to grieve anything major before. And I didn't know what that was like, what that process was like. And so that's kind of how it all started. And I did have a second pregnancy that I also lost, and I experienced postpartum depression after that, which is a whole thing. And I don't know, do you want me to share my whole story? Do you want to take it piece by piece, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point about not really knowing that either you should grieve or that you're allowed to grieve. And like you said, everybody experiences things like this differently too. But I think that's another reason why having information like this podcast out in the world is so important, because I think a lot of women do feel like, oh, like I didn't tell anybody I was pregnant, or this isn't something that I should be sharing. And it just brings up a lot of those kind of feelings where you're not sure what to feel. And so you feel kind of alone because you don't think anybody else feels the same way.
Yeah. And I was someone who shared with quite a few people right off the bat. And I felt like I was judged for that. Like, oh, you shouldn't be telling people yet. And then, to tell those same people that I had a miscarriage, and then people, you got that feeling like, oh, this is uncomfortable for me that you're sharing this with me. And that was really hard for me. And I didn't know anyone who had been through miscarriages before. And part of that was that I was one of the first of my friends to even start having a family. And so that just wasn't and then the other part of that is that it's not something that historically people have talked about very much publicly.
Yeah. And I was in a similar situation. Like I was one of the first in my friend group to start having, or start planning to have a family, I guess. And so I made sure that I let my friends know. I don't think I let them know until after I was announcing my pregnancy with my son. But I did let them know, like, hey, this is not my first pregnancy, and I want you guys to know that, so that if something like that happens to you, you know that you have somebody you can talk to about it.
Yeah.
And then, so what was kind of the time span between the first loss and the second one?
It was really quick. We actually got pregnant again very quickly, first cycle back trying. And so I don't even think I'd really started processing or grieving the first one when I lost the second one. And so I was kind of trying to grieve both of them at the same time, and also wrap my head around, I'm 29 years old or whatever I was at that point, and have had 2 miscarriages and no successful pregnancies. What does this mean? And the fear of, am I going to be able to have a child? Am I going to be able to carry a pregnancy successfully? What's wrong with my body and all that? And at the time, the healthcare program that I was in, their policy was not to do any pregnancy loss testing until you'd had 3 in a row. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I just lost 2 pregnancies in my 20s. Right. And you're telling me there's definitely nothing wrong. And so there's no reason to do testing. And that was really frustrating and hard and scary too.
Yeah. And I remember thinking, after I had my miscarriage, like I want to say that my doctor told me something similar. Like, we wouldn't even think it's unusual at all until 2 in a row. And we wouldn't really look into it seriously until 3 in a row. And I just remember thinking, like, so I have to go through this again, and maybe again after that. It was such an overwhelming feeling. It was just like, I don't know if I want to keep going through that. So, I was very fortunate and got pregnant again quickly, and we have our son now. But I hate hearing about that from, like, that advice is still such a thing in the medical community, to make women and their partners and their families go through this so many times before looking into possible causes.
Yeah. And then, I pushed and pushed and pushed, and finally my OB ran a couple of tests, but I think she was just trying to appease me, because looking back and after I'd done a lot of research and now know, the type of test you run, they didn't really make sense what she ran. And I had done a bunch of research on my own, and because of what I was seeing on my cycles, I had decided maybe I had a low progesterone issue. And so I asked her if she would give me a progesterone supplement to try with my next pregnancy. And she did. And in fact, my next pregnancy was successful. And it resulted in my son, who's now 7.5 years old. And so in my head, I was like, maybe it was the progesterone that finally worked. Maybe I, just have naturally low progesterone. And then we were pretty much right after we had him, we didn't have marital relations for like months afterwards, but as soon as we did, we weren't using protection, because I was like, I don't know how long it's going to take to have another baby. I really want them close in age. And before he turned 1, we became pregnant again, and I went on the progesterone again, but this one I lost again. So at this point, we knew that it wasn't the progesterone, right? That had resulted in the successful pregnancy. And so now I was at 3 losses, and my OB did refer us to a reproductive endocrinologist to do full recurrent miscarriage testing.
Okay.
And it was a process to do that testing. And during that time, we were not planning on trying to get pregnant again, but we did, have one. I wouldn't call it a whoops. You know what I mean? When you actually want to be pregnant and you're trying to try not to be pregnant, it's very, it's kind of a mind F, but
yeah, for sure.
So we did become pregnant before all the testing was in, but some of the testing was in that suggested I might have a blood clotting thing. And so we did, I did injections of, I can't remember what it's called, some blood thinning medication during that pregnancy, but I lost that pregnancy as well. And so I had lost 4 of my 5 pregnancies by this point. And, I was just, the whole thing was very traumatic for me, especially even the successful pregnancy was a traumatic experience, because I was so anxious the whole time, because I didn't know what went wrong with the first 2 and if it was something that could go wrong later in the pregnancy. Right. And so the whole pregnancy, I was just terrified, and I tend to suffer from anxiety anyway. And so I was anxious the whole pregnancy. We also did have complications at the end, preterm labor concerns, and I was on bed rest and all this other stuff. And then to have 2 more miscarriages, and it was just like I had been through the ringer mental health wise.
Yeah.
And finally we did get an answer, which I know a lot of people never do get an answer, which is really hard, because for me, the not knowing is some of the hardest part. And I found out that I am a carrier for a chromosome translocation, which is where a piece of one of your chromosomes has broken off, and a piece of another one has broken off, and they have switched places and adhered to the opposite chromosome. So for me, it's chromosomes 10 and 12, but this can happen with any chromosomes, and the breaks can be big or they can be small. And so depending on the chromosomes involved, how big or small the breaks are and where the breaks have occurred, it can result in all sorts of different outcomes. Some people can't even get pregnant because the breaks are so big that the problems are very incompatible with life. Some people get pregnant, but they have miscarriages. And then some people can have a child that has, some developmental issues because of those little breaks. And so for me, it was resulting in the miscarriages, but we consulted with a genetic counselor who talked us through my particular breaks and kind of gave us an estimation of how likely we are to have a future miscarriage, how likely we are to carry to term if the child does inherit the chromosome translocation, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And on all that, we just decided it was not worth the risk to get pregnant naturally again. And so we went through IVF. And with IVF, they can do chromosome testing of the embryos before they put them back inside of you. And so we chose to do that option, and we became pregnant with my daughter that way.
So it was after the 4th miscarriage that they discovered the chromosome issue?
And they weren't even going to test for that. That was actually something that I'd researched on my own. I had gone in with my reproductive endocrinologist with my long list and was like, here's all the tests I know about. Here's the ones you ran. How come you didn't run, X, Y, and Z? And we went through the reasons why. And the reason that he hadn't is because supposedly you're less likely to be positive for this issue if you have already had a healthy birth, which I had at that point. And he said, it's not very common and the testing's very expensive. And I was like, I don't care, run it. I want all the answers. And then sure enough, that one came out to be the reason. So
yes, well, it sounds like we have a similar personality type, because I always want all of the answers as well. And I know you had mentioned with one of the losses that you experienced kind of like a postpartum depression. Was that the case for you at any point following either of your live births?
Yeah, after my son, I wouldn't say I had postpartum depression, but I definitely had postpartum anxiety. And this is only in retrospect.
Yeah.
I never went to the doctor about it, but when he was like, I didn't sleep at all with him. He was just the worst sleeper in the entire universe. And he had colic, and he was kind of a monster baby. I love him dearly. But he was a monster baby. And I just remember like I was going on no sleep, and my mom would come and like pull him in the other room for me so that I could take a nap. But I would just like I could hear her, out in the kitchen with him, like cooking a meal or something. And all I could do was like imagine her like dropping him into like a pot of boiling water or something. Like all I could imagine were these like horrible scenarios happening to him. And so, yeah, there was definitely some anxiety there.
Yeah, no, and I had a very similar experience. And I think just like you said, it's like a combination of not fully working through all of the emotions that come with losing a pregnancy. And then just like you said, like exactly the same for me, like the anxiety just sort of carried all the way through the pregnancy. And I was always like kind of looking, over my shoulder or whatever, like when is something going to go wrong? Like, and so, I mean, kind of a side note, I guess, but I would be really interested in your take on that from kind of like a personality perspective. Are there certain things that people who are listening to this podcast might want to consider about themselves and whether they're more susceptible to kind of some of these long lasting effects, and what could we do if we're noticing that we're suffering from some of those effects?
Yeah. I mean, from a personality standpoint, there's all sorts of things to consider, but like the personality type model that I work with the most is Myers-Briggs, and which is the personality type model that's denoted by 4 letters. So like I'm an INFJ.
Oh, and we're close. I'm INFJ.
Okay. Yeah. And so anyone with that J at the end, we have a harder time with things being open-ended and not being able to have control over what's happening and being able to plan. And so I think that feeling of not having a control over the situation and being able to plan for it can be really hard. And so I know that's one of the things that I'm not saying that if you're a P, it's easy to go through miscarriage. It's just a different, you just process it differently. Right. And so you may have challenges, but they're going to be different. And so that can be really hard, of that letting go of being able to see the future and have control over it. And that, we can be prone to anxiety when we feel like a lack of control. But, anxiety, it's kind of one of those things, it happens, it's a pattern in the brain. And so when the bottom has fallen out from underneath us and we're in that state of, what's happening? Am I losing this pregnancy? And then especially if it happens a second time, like it did for me, your brain almost gets rewired to look for that happening again. And so it's not that you're a crazy person. Like your brain is literally doing what it's supposed to do, which is danger has happened. And now I'm going to teach you how to look for danger. And so your brain is just making these new connections now where it's constantly looking for danger, which helped us in the caveman days when we needed to constantly look for danger. But it's not helpful when there isn't something about to come flying at you. And so seeing a doctor and working through that is really important. With my daughter, I had postpartum depression, which didn't hit right away. It hit at about 2 months after she was born. And so I would just say, for anyone, and this is whether you had a miscarriage, a stillbirth, or a healthy baby, look for it in the future too. Just because you didn't have it right away doesn't mean it won't develop later.
Yeah. And I had heard something on a documentary that depression can kind of stem from like a prolonged period of anxiety. It's almost like the crash after, which really resonated with me because just like you, I spent my whole pregnancy so worried about every little thing. And then he was born and he was healthy and he was a terrible sleeper, but it was just like crash. Like I had, been so worried, and your body is just like in that constant arousal, and then you're getting no sleep and you're dealing with this new identity, and it's a complete crash.
Yeah.
So, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but what do you think helped you through like some of the hardest times when you were building your family and going through this whole experience?
Yeah, I think connecting with others was really important for me. And that was difficult because I didn't know anyone who had been through it. And where I found a way to connect was through online, miscarriage support groups. I started on forums, and I was posting so often on them that I kind of had like a group of people that I started keeping in touch with, and I would follow their stories and ask them how they were doing with either their new pregnancies or their new medication that they were going on to try and become pregnant or whatever. And we became really close, and we kind of created our own little group and just followed each other. And still some of them, I have reached out to here and there, and we're Facebook friends or whatever. And just having people who understand maybe not exactly what you're going through, but really close to understanding what you're going through, to have in your corner, to ask, how did this appointment go? And that sort of thing. Because my in real life friends didn't really know to do that for me. They didn't realize how it was consuming my every waking hour. And then I needed someone to check in and say, did you have that, HCG blood result yet? And what was it? And just have someone to talk through all those things with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it is kind of an interesting thing. Like, for some reason, we don't talk to the people that we, see in real life about this stuff as much. But however you can find a community around it, if you do happen to know people in real life who've experienced it, that's such a valuable resource. I just think that in general, it's still not something that's really talked about as much as it should be face to face. And yeah, in the world we're in right now too, like going online for connection is just kind of where we're at. So I think that's great advice. Is there anything that you wish you would have known, or anything you wish you would have done differently going through that experience?
Yeah, my personality type is very much like a push through things and keep going. And like, once I have my mind stuck to like my picture of how things are going to be, I'm like really driven to make that happen. So my idea was, I want to have kids as early as possible. My husband was older, and so that was one consideration. And I want to have them close together in age. And that was really important to me. And so I didn't give myself breaks in between the losses, like to take time to process and grieve and get back to a mentally healthy state before I start again. And I just kind of pushed myself through those few years and never gave myself time to like breathe and process and grieve and be healthy. And I think that had a lot to do with what a difficult state I was in after my daughter was born. And then I was trying to deal with a baby and a toddler while in a very mentally unhealthy state. And it took me years to figure it out. And having kids is hard. Either way, whether you've experienced trauma in bringing them into the world or not, it's really hard. And if you're not in a strong mentally healthy state when you have them, that makes you're putting yourself at even more risk for issues. And so I wish that I had taken more time and really worked on myself through it. If I had to do it, in retrospect. But I don't at the time, people would tell me to do that, but I couldn't hear it because I just had the blinders on. And I empathize with my past self. Like I understand what it's like to want something so badly that you can't imagine like stopping and not working at it. And so, I get it. If that's you and you're not ready to hear that message, you know what? You do you. I figured it out after the fact, you know what I mean? But
yes, no, and I've had the same thoughts, and I know I wouldn't have listened at that point either. But it's great advice. It's something to consider. I know that it's not going to be for everybody, but I think it does contribute to some of those like after effects that we were talking about if you don't take the time to process these things. And the other piece too, we've kind of talked about throughout, if you have any advice on doing research to find out some of the medical things that might be going on. I know we have some resources that the listeners can look at on the Miscarriage Hope Desk website. But what was that experience like for you, kind of doing the research by yourself and bringing that information to the doctor? Because it sounds like you really had to push to get your point across. And a lot of women, for many different reasons, don't feel comfortable kind of pushing medical professionals, or just really think, the medical professionals, they know what's right, and I'm just going to follow them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's part of my needing to have control over everything was what drove that, right? And I would just talk to different people on different forums and gather their information and put it all together. And, my reproductive endocrinologist was pretty open to having me say, like, here's what I read on a forum, and I understand that, and I would preface it with, I understand that everything you read on a forum isn't true, but I want to get your take on it. And he was pretty open to, I think he gets those questions a lot. And so he was pretty open to talking about them with me. And just from like, yes, they have a lot of experience and they are experts at it. And I totally trusted him from that standpoint, but they have so many cases. They have so many patients. Yes. They really just don't have that much time to pay full attention to your case and to spend their own time researching it and considering it, because that's just how our medical system is set up. Yes. In order for them to make enough money to live on, they need to have 1 million different patients. And, so I needed to be proactive in order to make sure that I was being thoroughly, cared for, and every rock was being upturned.
Yeah. And I think it's something that you kind of have to balance between, like, some people would say, oh, I just had this intuition or this feeling that there was something else going on. And then kind of recognizing the medical perspective as well. Like, I know when I was working in the schools as a school psychologist, like, it's the same kind of system, right? There are so many students. There's one psychologist for way too many students, and you have to kind of triage and think about, like, what's in the average range? Is it in the average range for you to have 2 miscarriages? Yes, it is, technically. So at least, that's the way the profession is set up right now. So it's not a red flag for them, but it's a red flag for you. And I think just encouraging women to really be proactive is a great step.
Yeah.
Do you have any final advice or anything else that you want to share with someone who may be listening and, relates to your story?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess just kind of reach out over the podcast waves and give a social distance hug. And, it's tough. It was a really traumatic time in my life. And I'm at a point now where it's in the past. And like, that's not to say that it doesn't still affect my life in some way, but I'd say I've come to a place where I've learned so much from it and gone through all my mental health struggles over the past few years and become like a new, improved person almost because of it. And, you come to a place of not only acceptance, but even gratitude of what you've been through and what it's taught you. And so, I'm many years removed from it, it's able to have a whole different perspective on it, but it was really difficult and really traumatic at the time. And so my heart goes out to anyone who's currently struggling.
Yeah, I think in retrospect, like, you can look back and see what it taught you, and how you grew from the experience, but it is so, so difficult to go through.
Yeah.
So where could the listeners reach out to you online if they want to connect?
Yeah, you can check me out on Instagram. I do post pictures of my kids. So if you are at a state where you're not okay seeing that, totally get that. But my handle on Instagram is Family Personalities. You can check out my podcast, which is also called Family Personalities. And that's it.
Great. Well, Sandra, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you for joining us today, and don't forget to check out our show notes for details on joining our Facebook group and for following along on Instagram. If you would like a free recurrent pregnancy loss lab checklist, go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/labs. Again, that's miscarriagehopedesk.com/LABS to get your free downloadable checklist. And for even more resources, visit the Miscarriage Hope Desk website, where we have stories of hope plus an entire library of evidence-based research articles related to fertility and miscarriage. If you enjoyed this episode, I would so appreciate it if you rate, reviewed, and subscribed to the Miscarriage Hope Desk podcast. Your ratings and reviews will help others to find us. I want to wrap up by saying that if you are going through a miscarriage, my heart goes out to you, and as difficult as your experience may be, I want you to know that you are not alone and that you will find a path forward.